Thank you so much for joining us here this evening at the Suzanne Roberts Theater in Philadelphia. It feels so good to see people in person and to reconnect on world affairs and a variety of other topics. We do have guests joining us online, so thank you for joining us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and far beyond for our Diplochat conversation tonight. My name is Lauren Swartz, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit and international affairs experience provider that's been connecting Philadelphia to the world for over 70 years. We bring world affairs education into the classroom, bringing 2,500 students across our region the opportunity to understand the world and opportunities around them. We provide travel experiences going to every continent. 35. There we go. We go to every continent every year with over 30 international educational tours, and of course we visit Israel often. We offer professional development, and mostly we offer the opportunity to connect at opportunities like tonight, where we bring world leaders, change makers, diplomats who've been selected by their heads of state to represent their country here in ours, for a conversation, for an opportunity to create access for anyone to ask their questions to the people shaping our world. And the theme of our series is Diplochat. We can't take credit for this word that we've made up. It comes to us from the Honorary Consul of Chile, as we were talking about how do we bring diplomats to the people? How do we make it more of a conversation or a chat? And he said, let's have a Diplochat. And that's what we'll do tonight. So our format is not a long speech. It's not a formal panel discussion. It's a conversation between our guest of honor tonight and you all online, and you all joining us in person here at the theater. This series of Diplochat for the whole year is made possible by the support of the Satell Family Foundation. And this foundation, headed by Ed and Sima Satell, aims to create opportunities to connect philanthropy and corporate social responsibility to do good across Philadelphia. We have a variety of other event partners here tonight supporting us as well and bringing this opportunity to you. Our attorneys at Royer, Cooper, Cohen, and Braunfeld are a supporting partner of this event tonight. The American Jewish Committee of Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey, the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Israeli Chamber of Commerce, and of course, the Consul General of Israel in New York. Just a few items of housekeeping tonight. It is a hybrid program, so if you'd like to ask a question and you're in the audience, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. If you don't speak into the microphone, we might not hear you up here, but certainly our guests online won't understand or be able to hear the question that you've asked. For those of you who are joining us online, use the Zoom Q&A feature to type in your question, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. And keep in mind, we'd like you to make sure that your question is in fact a question, so the ambassador knows how to respond. Rather than making a statement or a comment, make sure we have a specific question you'd like to ask the ambassador to address. And try and keep it as concise as possible so we have as many opportunities as possible to answer questions. There's a digital program book which is linked on our website. It was posted on the QR codes in the lobby, and it's also in the Zoom chat if you'd like to learn more about our program or our organization. I'd also like to thank our venue partner here tonight, the Suzanne Roberts Theater. It is so nice to be back in a theater in Philadelphia. Of course, we've got a light crowd tonight. We intentionally kept it smaller so we can have an intimate discussion and create the opportunity for social distancing. Please, we do ask you to wear your masks during the program as well. Health and safety is still paramount, and we want to follow the rules so we can come back. Lastly, we're on social media, and you're welcome to post your thoughts or photos or opportunities and ideas from the event. You can find the World Affairs Council on all the platforms at hashtag WACPHL or hashtag WACDiplochat. And now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce a good friend of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, Mr. Ed Satell. Ed Satell has been an inimitable business leader in our region for 50 years with success in media and e-commerce. Ed has a lot of sayings for those of you who know them, and one of them is, think we, not just me. And that's what we're doing tonight. We're thinking about how to connect with people from different countries, and we're making an impact on our region from people of all different ages and all different backgrounds. Ed would be upset with me if I read off all of his list of accomplishments and accolades, but I can assure you they are quite many, and many of those accomplishments and awards and honorary degrees come from Israel and his relationship with the Jewish community as well. Ed likes to focus on creating opportunities and access for people to learn, and that's just what we're here to do tonight. Ed, please join me on stage to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Lauren has done such a great job with the World Affairs Council. And I'm going to just say one thing that's obvious. Although she does such a fabulous job, she was not here at the beginning 70 years ago, but has enabled a tradition in this community that is terrific. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for tonight's events, Diplomat, a conversation on U.S. Israeli relations. My name is Ed Satell, and I've had the pleasure of being involved with the Council as a supporter and a board member for more than 25 years. In all those years, I have found to be most unique and valuable about the Council's events is the access to the programs provided by the Philadelphians. Because of the Council, we all in this area have access to the thought leaders and policymakers who shape our world. That access is vital for an informed citizenry and has never been more important or impactful than now. That is why I'm thrilled that this series, which brings diplomats to Philadelphia, is named in honor of the Satell Family Foundation. I'm delighted to give a brief introduction to tonight's guest, Ambassador Asaf Zamir. Ambassador Zamir currently serves as the General Consul of Israel in New York, a position he assumed in 2021. In this capacity, Ambassador Zamir serves as the representative of the State of Israel to the Mid-Atlantic region. Prior to this role, Ambassador Zamir was elected deputy mayor of the city of Tel Aviv, their council, in 2008, and was reelected for that position again in 2013, at which time he assumed the responsibility for the city's educational system. In 2019, he entered national politics in Israel. And politics is both a sport and a very strong activity in Israel. And he was appointed as the Minister of Tourism in 2020. And as you all know, the Minister of Tourism is a very important position in Israel. Mr. Zamir, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Council President and CEO Lauren Schwartz for tonight's program. Ambassador.
Thank you for that introduction.
Thank you, Ed, and welcome, Ambassador Zamir.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Hello, everyone.
As we said, we'll make this a very casual conversation, and we're grateful that the ambassador has agreed to have just sort of a discussion between the two of us, but I promise not to hog all of the questions. So I know there are many of you with things you'd like to ask. But first, I'd like to offer the opportunity for you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you hope to achieve as Consul General?
Well, honestly, some of my background was just explained. My professional career was in politics, both local and governmental, and the highest of it was being part of the unity government in Israel, the Gantz-Netanyahu government, which I resigned from after a few months and left politics and joined a venture capital fund in Tel Aviv and thought I'm gonna spend a few years less stressful. And a few months in, I got a call from the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, who asked us to move to New York and represent Israel in what is the biggest diplomatic mission of Israel outside of Israel, the center of Jewish organized life outside of Israel, overseeing New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Delaware, and tackling some of the major challenges, international challenges Israel has regarding the relationship between Israel and American Jewry, between Israel and the United States at large, and Israel and the political American system. This is a role that I believe was easier once. I grew up in Florida, and I remember in the 80s when Israel was a very consensual issue in the United States. It was a very bipartisan issue in the United States, and almost all of the American Jews felt that Israel was equally theirs and had a very developed connection and identity towards Israel and towards their Judaism. And fast forward 30-something years, and partially because of things that happened in Israel, and partially because of things that have happened in the United States, that situation has changed for the worse in certain areas, for the better in others, and those are some of the things that I deal with on a daily basis. I'm sure we'll talk about them this evening if you'll want to.
Absolutely. That's one of those phone calls that you sort of always hope you might get if you're in politics, but also dread getting. The foreign minister saying, hey, I need you to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And here you are in New York.
It is. The exact words were, what are you doing these days? I'm in a venture capital. Are you enjoying it? Not really. Good. I have a request.
Yeah.
That was the exact conversation.
Yeah. And now you can't screen his phone calls, so whatever comes next.
You can never screen his phone calls because they're always unidentified.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, such is the life of a diplomat. Wonderful. Well, we're happy to have a conversation tonight. Again, we'll take many questions from the audience. We've got some questions on Zoom. But I'll kick us off with a few things. There's always a lot of news coming out of Israel, even though it's a less bipartisan supported issue within the United States. We're always wanting to know what's going on in Israel. And of course, over the weekend, the news has been dominated by the story of the Al Jazeera journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot, of course, in the West Bank last week, and then during her funeral over the weekend, as we've seen on the news, there were images seen all over the world, right, of the pallbearers being attacked and being hurt by Israeli police. These images, of course, were difficult for anyone to watch and difficult to understand. So I'd like to start. I know this is on everybody's mind, so we'll jump right in. You told me we could jump right in, so here we go.
You could jump right in. We can ask any question.
You heard it here, folks. What can you share with us about the Israeli government's position? What can the world expect as common and next steps after seeing this?
I want to put it into context. In context, in the last month, 3 terror attacks came out of Jenin, in which 19 Israelis were murdered, drinking beers, watching TV, sitting in their cars, running in the park, innocent civilians that were murdered for living in Israel and being Jewish. And the IDF had to go into Jenin and try to find the terror cell and dismantle it before another terror attack comes out. That was the raid on Jenin. Did we have the option not to? In a democracy defending itself? No. Is the situation between Israelis and Palestinians extremely complicated? Very. We can go into that if you want. Very. Would I like to see a different outcome with peace in the region? Very much. But the fact of the matter is, right now, at this point in time, it is 2 peoples living alongside each other, not in a balance of power, but in which terror attacks, when they happen, we have to fight back to make sure we can defend ourselves. And in that raid, Shireen Abu Akleh was shot and killed, and we don't know how yet. And first of all, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy when any reporter in any war zone gets shot and killed. I said on the news yesterday on CNN, Al Jazeera has lost 10 reporters in the last few years in war zones in the world for those reasons. The first 9 you haven't heard of the same amount as the 10th one that happened in Israel. Because when things happen in Israel, as you said, they tend to be covered massively. And people tend to have a stronger opinion about either rather than when they happen in Syria or wherever. We called for a joint investigation. We agreed to have a third party in that investigation. We wanted to get down to the bottom of it, understand how it happened, to try and prevent it, because free press is extremely important in Israel. We do believe it's a tragedy, and we came out and said we don't know how it happened. We didn't say, at the end of the day, it's not us. We said we don't know. And we're sorry it happened anyhow. And the Palestinian side has not yet agreed to have this investigation, even though the United States administration tried to pressure them into having a joint investigation. But the way it was delivered in some of the media in the world started from the point of which this journalist was shot and killed, and not for the reason for there to be a raid in there to begin with. And that lacks a certain context understanding. And there is a difference. Every life is a life, and every tragedy is a tragedy, but there is a difference between someone at work covering a war conflict zone entering freeway and a person sitting at a bar drinking a beer with his fiancée or is sitting with his kids in the car. It is two different things. And we're never on, it's never easy to explain that because every death is a tragedy, but that's what happened. And I hope that we'll get to the bottom of it, and we are open for investigation, we are open for transparency, and we are open for taking responsibility and being accountable and trying to make that not happen. Will that prevent us from raiding the next place we'll have to if terrorist cells come out of them murdering innocent people? No, never. That's our life in Israel right now. After that, there's a funeral. And Israel and the Israeli police is in charge of public safety and making sure the funeral is safe and guarded and whatnot. And the Israeli police coordinated with Shireen Abu Akleh's family, the path, the grave, where the coffin goes, who carries it and everything. And at the beginning, there was a riot where certain people inside the village took by power the coffin and tried to take it to another direction, throwing bottles at the police and doing many things that made the police had to intervene to make sure that that funeral goes as planned. And that is the clash that you saw. And again, it's a horrible picture. And it was even hard for me to look at that picture because no matter how you explain it, what you see is police beating up people at a funeral, which is unbearable, as I say. And also there might have been excessive force. This is a very, very, very tense area and very, very complicated to manage. It's very easy to look at from the side and say, oh, I do this and maybe you should do that. When you have to physically manage it, it is very complex. You have a lot of decisions you need to make, and sometimes you make mistakes, and maybe some were made. And there's also a formal investigation looking at that and checking it if there was excessive force to make sure that doesn't happen again. But it's not intentional, and it doesn't happen just out of spite.
I do, right, so time will tell. And calls for investigations are underway. And so I think we can leave that there for the moment.
I could take more questions about that if you want.
Well, I'm not an investigative reporter. And
well, maybe someone here is.
There's a few of you out there. But let's take this conversation and shift it into, on reading the background about you, one of your objectives is to help create more unified support and connectivity between America in a bipartisan way and the relationship with Israel, which you mentioned. We have a question from our online audience from Lawrence, and he says, polls show declining support for Israel among younger American Jews who take a more even-handed approach to the conflict with the Palestinians. Instead, Israel's growing support in the U.S. is from evangelical Christians who see Israel in messianic terms. Does this shift in the nature of support from the U.S. concern Israel?
It does. It concerns Israel because the United States is Israel's greatest ally, and because for many years since the establishment of the State of Israel, there was an alliance based on the understanding of shared values, shared interests, and the understanding of the importance of liberal values and democracy. And we share borders with countries that feel differently. in a region that most people feel differently in. And it's extremely important to understand the value of that. Now, I always say that is the main issue. Inside of it, there can be criticism, things that should be done differently, the conflict that I wish will be resolved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the basis of it, the historical basis of it, why there is a Jewish state. And I tell people, I'm ninth generation Israeli. I'm ninth generation Israeli. My family's in Israel since 1750. Every time I hear the word colonialism in regards to Israel, I remind people that if you look at it truly historically, this has been our homeland forever and ever. We've been persecuted, kicked out, can't come back, and all that, but it has been our home forever. And after the Holocaust, the world, through the UN, decided this will be our home again, and we've been in a constant position of fighting for it ever since. And the Independence War, and the Six-Day War, and the Gulf War, and the Yom Kippur War, and the Intifadas, and there was a partition we agreed to. Palestinians did not till this day. And we've been in constant need to fight for our legitimacy. But that, on one hand, is a very progressive struggle. It's a very progressive struggle in the respect that it is the struggle of the right for self-determination of the Jewish people after thousands of years in their own homeland. Unlike many progressive struggles, it succeeded. And we've established a country, and it turned into a really good country, and a very successful country that contributes to the world with a very strong economy, with amazing innovation, with new peace agreements from the United Arab Emirates to Morocco and Sudan and Bahrain, and a lot of good that's come out of it. But we are very strong, and if you don't take that first part about the importance of the establishment of the democracy and look at Israel just from today, from a perspective of a strong country with its issues, I think that is something that generally categorizes a lot of the younger people in the United States, and they look at the situation without the background, and then the support is getting weaker than it used to be. That's one reason. There are other reasons, I believe. I think that when I grew up, Israel was a consensus. It was consensual. It was a consensus in the United States. And the United States has become extremely polarized politically, meaning there are two groups in this country that define themselves politically by what the other group is not. And succeeding to stay a consensus in that kind of atmosphere is virtually impossible. So just thinking that Republicans and Democrats that let alone fight about everything right now in the United States will say, you know what, but Israel, let's all hug. Let's all hug around that. It's kind of naive. And when you go to younger groups and they're more polarized and radical politically, that makes them choose on both sides. And I think there are a lot of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and also anti-Semitic groups in the United States that tap into that. And in the battle of image, in that way, we're not doing a very good job, and we're not in the best place we've ever been. And that does trouble me. And it troubles me because I value this relationship. So does my country, and I think it's important. I want to see it continue forever.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up the Abraham Accords, which is a real bright spot in foreign policy and geopolitical relationship building. There's been a lot going on in foreign policy in the past few years around the world, of course. And it's a real celebration to see that Abraham Accords happened, right? And that new alliances were formed and old walls were broken down. Can you talk to us about what the last 2 years have looked like since the Abraham Accords came to pass? And is it a pathway forward for is it a good model to continue to build further relationships in the Arab world for Israel?
Well, in the last 2 years, there's been COVID, and I became a father, so I haven't slept a lot. Those are much before the Abraham Accords. Those are the two main things that portrayed my life. Then moving here in the middle of those 2 years was the third thing. I just met the Consul General of the UAE this morning.
Okay.
And now, seriously speaking, I think it's the most important thing that's happened in the region in decades. I think it shows true potential that divides the continents, not between religions, but between moderates and radicals, between people that are looking for cooperation through things that unite us and people that celebrate the things that divide us, and proving that we can overcome some of the differences, and that countries that were so far away from us politically look and strive for relationships right now with us is very empowering, and it's proof to the world that there is room for optimism. Economically speaking, it's created amazing opportunities on both sides. I can tell you the tourism from Israel to the UAE is crazy. I can tell you the tourism this year to Morocco from Israel, suddenly for the first time, because it's huge. If you live in Israel, has anyone here ever lived in Israel? So if you live in Israel, you know what a big part of Israeli culture, Moroccan Jewish culture is in Israel. And the opening of Morocco as a peaceful country now, the ability for Israelis to go and travel over there has become a huge opportunity. And you also start seeing business opportunities, cooperations, high-tech cooperations, governmental cooperations, also through the UAE and Bahrain, and also through Morocco. And I'm sure that this is just the first step. And the most amazing thing, I think, that happened is, at least with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, but the UAE more than anyone, Bahrain, it automatically became very warm, the peace, because it was very, the feelings were very strong from both sides, and the dream to prove that it's good to do it was very strong, and it reached a point where we've had peace with Jordan and Egypt, but that peace has been pretty cold, and it's warmed up those relationships as well, because suddenly people on both sides said, you know, if it works so beautifully with the other countries, why isn't it working better with our neighbors? So it's even boomed cooperations between Israel and Jordan, and Israel and Egypt, and that is as happy, as good as, if not even better.
Maybe you should have another kid, and we'll see what amazing thing
My
happens.
wife wants more, another one. I'm still too tired.
Yeah.
It's very frightening.
Yeah. She didn't text me ahead of time.
What?
She didn't plant
didn't?
that
She
question.
didn't?
No. No. Speaking of questions, do we have any questions from our live audience here? All right. Okay. One, Mitchell, can you bring a microphone right down front here? Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming today. Matt Fingerman, I'm on the board at the Philadelphia Israel Chamber of Commerce. I think most of us here today are voted in the primary election. I'm just curious what you're most excited about in Philadelphia politics, or national politics, and also what is maybe most concerning given the political climate.
A nice, easy question.
The hardest part for moving from, I was a politician all my life and I became a diplomat. The hardest part in moving to being a diplomat is that you can't say everything you want or everything you think or feel. Because I will say this, I have extremely strong feelings about the primary. Not just in Philadelphia, I have extremely strong feelings towards midterm elections. I have very strong feelings, and I know at every certain point what's better for Israel, but I'll never name names, and I respect, I'm not American, and you are, and I respect your fundamental right to choose your representatives. I'll just say, from an Israeli perspective, that bringing bipartisanship back is a goal for us. And for that to happen, theoretically, the United States need to be, or the two parties need to be less polarized and need to have the ability to work together. So I strive for candidates that show ability to work with the other side to be elected, because that generally means good things about their ability to work together about Israel and to tackle complex messages and not to go to the fringe radical sides in which hatred is provoked, basically, and it's all kinds of hate. It's no matter on what side. The shooting in Buffalo 2 days ago was a white supremacist, and when you go scroll down his Twitter or Facebook, you can see anti-Semitic things in it, and hatred is hatred and takes the same shape and form, and you have to combat that. So going central is always what I strive for.
Thank you. Jessica, I see you had your hand up. Corey, could you bring a microphone to Jessica in the front here? Towards me. Thank you.
Good evening, Ambassador. Thank you again for being here. So you were talking earlier about the polarization over Israel in the younger generation, and as a member of the younger generation, I personally have experienced that on social media a lot. How do you think that social media has influenced the younger generation's perspective on Israel? And is there anything that Israel is doing to combat that through social media?
I think social media has affected every part of our life, including politics. And it has extremely strengthened groups that have been suppressed for many years, and has given voices to people that have never been heard before. And it's given people that lack resources the ability to regroup or to group and to gain power. And many times that's used for amazing things, and many times it's used for horrible things. So there's no clear-cut answer to that. But what it has done generally, it's given the same volume to very sane and very insane things. And it's sent people to live inside their own box or feed, which sometimes gives a misportrayal of what the world really is. And here, where freedom of speech is extremely important, even more defended than anywhere else in the world, where you can basically almost say anything, it's also been a breeding ground for a lot of hatred, for anti-Semitism, for racism, and it's made discourse very shallow. It's created very binary, yes and no, black and white, good and bad conversations. And again, it's an age issue, like you said, because if you're old enough, developed enough, and have experienced enough, then you can balance all of your wisdom and experience with that. But if you're not, and this is how you funnel in the world, then it can create distortion. And we have always been few versus many. And in social media, that multiplies. So the feeling you get that you're lost really is a factual-based feeling, because there's a few people defending this idea and a lot of people against it, even if they're wrong. And it's very frightening. The only thing we can do, and which I try to do, is try, this I'm saying from my perspective, this I'm saying from an Israeli perspective, is try to generate a narrative that is relevant for 2022, that is relevant for Gen Z, people online, that when you start speaking or saying something doesn't jump over their head, and where they stop listening after a second, and amplify influential people that are the right people to convey these messages. And this is the hardest part, and not to be intimidated. Because if you shout out against violence and anti-Semitism enough times, people will join you, and at the end of the day, people that are against you might push back. But it's very, very, very challenging, and right now we're not doing a good job at all at it, honestly. The other thing to remember is that it's not always the real. It seems as if it's the whole world, but it's not. I don't have a very good answer for you. That's honestly, it's our biggest problem, and it's the most violent area, the most aggressive area.
I've got a question right in the back in the center. Someone will bring you a microphone.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Ukraine's on a lot of people's mind right now.
What?
Ukraine is on a lot of people's mind right now. And early in the conflict, there was some press that Israel was straddling a line, partly because of coordination in Syria. Then, of course, the denazification term kept coming out, and Lavrov made some pretty nasty comments. Can you help us understand your relationship with Russia and your position on the war?
Yes. First of all, I'll start out by saying I was at a UJA event, the New York Federation event, and the manager of the UJA came over and said he just came back from Poland or the border of Ukraine. He said, listen, when you're there, all you see is Israeli flags. The biggest field hospital inside Ukraine, near Lvov, taking care of hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainians, is Israeli. All of the Israeli support groups and Jewish organized groups from all over the world, it's really heartwarming. But Israel is in an extremely problematic and unique position. It hasn't made us, at any point till today, it hasn't made us make the wrong claim or vote. At the end of the day, we joined the United States in the NATO votes and the UN votes. We chose a side, and the side is Ukraine. But we do have a problem when it comes to our interests, and we do have a problem when it comes to our values. On the interest point, you said it, I'll just say it shortly. Unlike you, we share an effective border with Russia. We are a small country that shares the Syrian border, is a Russian-controlled border. I say this almost every week. If it was up to us, we would really prefer American military presence in Syria and not Russian military presence in Syria. But that's not the reality, and we have to deal with that reality. And that is a Russian presence in Syria managing the central corridor, bringing in stuff from Iran. It is extremely important for the security of Israel to be able to coordinate that border. That's on the interest side. But that's even less important than the second part. And the second part is the value side. And the value side, unlike other countries, we have another angle here. Because we are the Jewish state, and our first and foremost responsibility is for the Jews of all the world. And there are 200,000 Jews in Ukraine, and we have an eternal responsibility towards them. And there are 500,000 Jews in Russia. We have the exact same responsibility towards them. And there are over 1 million ex-Soviet Union Olim in Israel, one of the strongest and largest communities in Israel, and having diplomatic corridors open with every country in former Soviet Russia, former USSR, is extremely crucial for the ability of Israel to remain the safe haven for every Jew in the world, and the only place that no matter what will always allow Jews in and be a home for Jews. And it is for that reason that it's very sensitive in Israel, that we need to have the ability to take care of Jews on both sides, and that's why we have a more complex position, and that's why Naftali Bennett, our Prime Minister, has tried to be a mediator between the two sides. It's blunt and it's out there. It's because of that interest, and it's really is our responsibility as a Jewish state. We've sent hundreds of tons of equipment and financial aid, and there are tons of Israelis on the ground in Ukraine helping, and the first huge, massive field hospital. We're doing everything in our possibility to end this from and staying on the Ukrainian side, but that is why we maintain a relationship with both sides.
Mort, you've got a question here? Or able to bring you a microphone?
My name is Morton Glite, and I'm an officer of the Zionist Organization of America. And I've been a local Philadelphian for a long time. And we have a vibrant Jewish community in Philadelphia, strong and active. But we, at one time, had a consul here. And that consul used to provide a lot of services, Jewish services, for Philadelphians. And since the consul left, we are really missing that. And I just would like to know whether the consul has any plans to increase their activities in Philadelphia. They did promise to do that when they closed their office and moved. So I just wanted to ask you that.
Well, obviously, I wasn't involved in the decision to close the consulate here, and I think I wish there was a consulate here. I wish we had the resources, by the way, to have much more consulates, because the United States is the second largest Jewish center in the world after Israel, and I wish we had a station everywhere there was a Jewish community, and I'm sad there isn't one here. But I oversee, and the consulate in New York oversees Philadelphia, and I arrived in New York a few months ago, and minus the winter COVID and me having COVID, started recently this position. This is my second day in Philadelphia, and 10 days from now will be my third time in Philadelphia, and I plan to come here as often as possible and to send over representatives as often as possible. And the reason I'm here today to meet you folks, and a few meetings I had before that in synagogues around the city is exactly that. And I hope that in a year's time, when we'll look back, you will say that you feel the presence better than before. COVID was hard. There was no consul. The deputy consul, my friend Israel Nitzan, was a stand-in consul because there was no consul, because Benjamin Netanyahu and Gabi Ashkenazi from the unity government couldn't decide on appointing someone. And when there is no consul, general consul, it's harder. And now we're rebuilding it.
Undoubtedly, this room will hold you accountable to those promises to come back. I see a question down here in the front. Corey will be with you in a moment with a microphone.
Hi, how are you? My name
That's
is
your
Jude.
question? I'm good. Thank
Go
you.
ahead. My name is Jude Hussein. There was an Amnesty report that came out. Amnesty is an international organization comprised of over 10 million people that go around for human rights, and they labeled Israel's apartheid against Palestinian, overlooking the wall, overlooking Israeli presence within respective Palestinian territories. And the question I pose to you is, number one, have you read the report, your thoughts on the report? And you know, the track as it came about, the Sheikh Jarrah, what's been happening there and how social media ramped it up, and now, the tensions now. So I guess it's a multi-part question. And your ideal look of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian community, and what your ideal way of going about figuring out what that solution looks like. So as you feel fit to answer any one of those questions.
I feel fit to answer all of them. I don't have perfect answers for any of them. I read the summary, the executive summary of the report. It's 30 pages out of 200, I think. I reject most of it. I think it was extremely biased. And I say that living in Israel. And the radical part of it was saying that this is what I want to start from, saying there's apartheid in Israel between Israelis, Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. Meaning that me and my friend Saeed in Jaffa live in an apartheid regime, which is a lie. It's a lie because 20% of the population inside Israel, taking the Palestinian territories out of it, inside Israel, are Arabs, Muslim and Christian, and we live in equal rights. Now, is there discrimination towards minorities in Israel? I haven't yet met the country that doesn't have discrimination in it towards minorities. Do we try to fight that and make sure equality is part of our life? Yes. Are we perfect? No. But the Israeli Arab community enjoys equal rights and is part, to a point, and it's so far-fetched to say apartheid about that, to a point where the Muslim Brotherhood Party is part of the governing coalition in Israel. In the cabinet, there is a Muslim minister. There is a Muslim Supreme Court judge who incarcerated our president. The chairman of the biggest bank in Israel is a Muslim Arab. Any hospital you enter, half the doctors and nurses are Arab. And looking at that and calling that apartheid, I think is extremely disrespectful for people who went through apartheid, who really did live in segregation, get on a bus and were told, sit in the back of the bus, okay? And that's stated in that report, so how can I take that seriously? When I live in Israel and have Arab friends that have the exact same rights that I do. That's A. B, comparing South African apartheid to the situation between Israel and Palestinians is also problematic the way I see it, because it's not one state with two classes of citizens. It's what I aspire to be, two different entities that are fighting, that can't make peace, but they're not one. They have their own governments and elections. We left Gaza in 2006. They were all alone there. No settlements and nothing. You'd think 16 years later, this would be a thriving democracy that took the world's resources and became an amazing place to live in. But that's not the path that was chosen there. There was zero interference inside since 2006. I explained before what happened the last week. It's very hard not to react to a city the terrorist attack comes out of and kills my friends in Tel Aviv. And I grew up in, a diplomat's not supposed to speak about politics, but I'm a former politician. You can Google my name and see where I've been and what I've said and what I aspire. I aspire to live in peace with Palestinians, and I think they should have their own home and their own state. And I'm willing to make concessions on the part of Israel to make that happen. But I'm also old enough to have seen 3 peace negotiations in which Ehud Barak and other prime ministers offered the world in order to make that, and that wasn't enough. And if you are an honest broker, you need to accept the fact that that it's not a one-sided conflict, and it's not that there is amazing Palestinian leadership just waiting on the other side to live at peace together that we can broker a deal with. The last 4 countries that knocked on our door and said we'd like to have a peace agreement, it took 5.5 minutes and there was a peace agreement. It's not that we're this negative, energetic superpower just wants to fight with everyone around us. Having said that, I don't think the situation right now is a situation that I'd want to see continue. And I think there are a lot of people in Israel, and I know there are a lot of people in Israel, when you see voting, the issues and all that, as there is a large group of people in Israel and also in the Palestinian territories that would want to live in peace. But sadly, that hasn't happened yet. And managing that situation from our side, being the stronger side physically, creates clashes that don't film well and don't always look well, but are also portrayed in a way that doesn't make justice with the exact reality. That's my opinion. Do you have a follow-up question? Do you want to react to that? Because I think it's an important question.
Yeah, I think the follow-up, a few things. The follow-up would be, countries can knock on your door and there's a peace agreement within 5.5 minutes, but it's easy to negotiate economics when they're not like dealing with it firsthand. I mean, you have a wall that's spanning all across. You have, checkpoints within respective Palestinian territory, which I've seen firsthand as a Palestinian-American that holds just an American passport. And I've been both on the Tel Aviv side, right? The resources are much more different. It's
Yeah.
easy when the West is giving you over billions of dollars, correct? For like
Well,
a whole bunch of.
To be honest, we gave all of Sinai back to have peace with what? We gave all of Sinai back to have peace with Egypt. So that wasn't the UAE. That was a very big concession, a very big piece of land, bigger than Israel, just to have peace with Egypt. I wish there was no need for a wall. The wall didn't just get up there for no reason. And I want to go back to Gaza again as an example of we do get aid from the world. Palestinians get a lot of aid from the world. And you have to ask yourself what that aid is used for. I know what the aid is used for. In our case, it's used for defense. And I know what the aid has been used for in Gaza because I see the rockets and the tunnels. I don't see schools being built. And it could have been a very different reality. And I wish it was. But to the fact of the matter, it's been 16 years. And I like to use Gaza as an example because there are no settlements in Gaza and blockades inside or anything. There could be extreme development, and there's tons of money poured into there, and there could be a true decision to develop that into an amazing example of how things could be, and it didn't happen. And I'm very sad that didn't happen, but it didn't happen.
I just want to touch on one of the questions I asked prior, and that goes to solution-driven ideas in the West Bank, particularly within those Palestinian territories, the checkpoints that are happening within those respective Palestinian territories that get blocked off, that don't allow Palestinians to go to work and et cetera. And as a person that has experienced, again, both sides, Tel Aviv, that has experienced the West Bank,
How was Tel Aviv? Do you like it?
I mean, I prefer the Palestinian side of things, but
That's
we
legitimate.
can chat. So what would be the ideal solution, like, to this
What would
war
be your
that is
ideal
happening?
solution?
I mean, I was posing the question to you, but I mean,
No, it's a conversation now. It's not just
I think
it's chat. It's a Diplo
yeah.
chat.
So, I think it goes back to Jewish and Muslims, but I don't look at it as a faith issue. I do not see it as a faith issue. I lived in Nablus for quite some time where there are Jews that are living amongst the hills with Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, Jewish, Israeli, like with generations of these people living, coexisting. It's real, it's there, and no one talks about it, right? We're faced with two people at odds for land purposes strictly. As a member of the interfaith community, as someone whose really closest friends are Jewish friends, who I've marched with, who I've rallied with, who I've spoke to, who I eat with, who I break bread with, my ideal solution is to step aside from that faith, that narrative that it's always about that faith difference, because at the end of the day, it is a land that is able to live and breathe and coexist with two people.
Well, for your question, to my belief, it's a land that could be divided. I'm not a very religious person. I am a peace-seeking person. I'm against violence of any kind. And I strive to live in peace. And as I do, lots of Israelis do. And some don't. And some Palestinians do, and some don't. And it's a two-sided story. It's never one-sided. There are any time in history, the lower the lower the frequency of terror attacks, for example, the lower the number of blockades. You know that. And the higher the work permits, and then the shared work areas. It really is, if you're there, if someone wants to be honest about it, it really is a defense issue. When there is no terror, when there is no violence, it's life. The less, the Oslo Accords try to prove that, the less violence there is, more coexistence, and I wish that happens, and I'm very committed to anything, or any idea to promote that. But not everyone on both sides is totally committed, and it's easy to light a fire and it's sometimes hard to put it down.
We've got a couple of questions left online that I'm going to mash into one because we're running short on time. In a universal challenge, climate change, right? Israel is a beautiful place and has a lot of climate issues and also has a lot of strength in technology. So we've got questions coming in on both. So I'm going to, forgive me, online audience, meld these questions together. Talk to us about Israel's position on climate change and perhaps how some of the incredible innovation and technology that comes out of your country might be used to mitigate climate.
Okay. It's very hard to move from the Palestinian issue to climate. It's
one big issue to the next.
One big issue to the next. But one is something you feel every day, and one is something you sometimes have to imagine in a way. I've always said that the most important thing for climate in the world is that the superpowers and the huge, big countries that really generate the highest amount of pollution, all that, we're a small country. Our contribution to emissions and it's a value-based discussion, but it's not a life-changing discussion. The technology, but we're committed and signed on all the agreements and everything, and we have a very serious Secretary of Environment, which is a friend of mine, which is very committed to lowering the levels of emissions of carbon and all those things. We are extremely innovative and have great contributions in areas regarding climate, mostly in renewable energy. And it starts out by being a young country that has very few natural resources and poor at the beginning of it, and is now at the forefront of renewable energies and solar energy. And even now, last thing I visited, water energy generated from waves in the sea. And that's one area that we're very strong in. The other area is water, I never say this word right.
Desalination?
Desalination.
Okay.
We reached a point where we almost didn't have enough water because we have one water base, which is the Kinneret, and it was drowning out, and it was a race against time to create the technology that would allow us to create enough water from seawater to drink, to usable water. And we reached a point where we're a world leader in that. Also, on one side, in generating water from seawater. On the other side, in even things like we are number one in the world, and we have minimalized to a minimum the amount of water you need to water the lawn to get the same effect. So we're also generating water from the sea, but also saving water in respects of how much water you need to. Those are the major things that in Israel. And the third thing, which is really important for climate, and is maybe the most interesting industry right now in Israel, is the food tech industry. Because when you look at meat, red meat, its effect on the climate, then some of the most interesting technologies regarding cultured meat from many kinds is coming out of Israel, and not just meat. We had a UN event this week that brought together startups from food tech in Israel. I ate a poached egg that looks like a poached egg, and when you take a fork, feels like a poached egg, and tastes 98% like a poached egg. I won't lie, 97% like a poached egg. But if it was sitting on a piece of bacon covered in hollandaise sauce, you wouldn't know. You'd think it's a poached egg, and it's made out of a carrot. Crazy stuff. And the food industry in the world, which is one of the major generators of the climate crisis, is going to drastically change. And I think we're going to be a world leader in that as well.
We look forward to trying the poached eggs made from
Try
carrots.
them. It's called Yo.
Yeah, nice.
It's crazy.
We have a new sculpture in Philadelphia called Yo. I don't know if you've heard it.
No, I have
It
not.
says, it's outside of our Jewish museum, and it says yo in one front, and the opposite side it says oi.
Oh,
So this is a
that is
very
very Jewish.
Philadelphia.
That is very Jewish.
Yeah, it's very Jewish and very Philly. Well, you know, I don't think we can beat a poached egg made out of a carrot, and we're out of time. So
Okay.
on that note,
That went by fast.
yeah, it did go by fast. The Consul General, thank you for your time. Thank
you.
you all for your questions and attention. And of course, to the Satell Family Foundation and Royer Cooper Cohen and Braunfeld for their support tonight and our partnership with the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Israeli Chamber of Commerce, and the American Jewish Committee of Philadelphia and South Jersey to bring together this intimate discussion tonight where we covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. I personally appreciate how open and relaxed and conversational you are. You don't always get that with diplomats. Recovering politicians as diplomats more often. It's a more fun conversation.
I haven't heard recovering politician yet. I'm going to use that.
All right, well, you're welcome. And to our audience, we hope you enjoyed the program and will join us again soon and perhaps consider becoming a member of the council. We've got a few upcoming programs, Careers in Diplomacy. If this has inspired you to become a diplomat yourself, on June 2nd, we've got an American ambassador coming to talk about careers in diplomacy in the U.S. Something fun on June 6th, we're doing Global Quizzo. If you're a world affairs nerd, like many of us in this room, and you like Quizzo, join us at Love City Brewing on June 6th for a Johnny Goodtimes quiz to compete with your world affairs knowledge. And returning a little bit closer to home for us, we're partnering with the orchestra on June 14th for a program at the Kimmel Center about the future of the European Union project in the Hamilton Gardens. And we look forward to seeing you there and at many more events coming up this summer and the fall. You'll receive a survey after this program, either online or via email. We really appreciate your feedback. We're all sort of re-emerging, re-entering society, and we'd love to hear what you think about our programs and how we could do things even better next time. With that, thank you all for your time, your attention, and thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.